Hi there guys, got a video here for you today on the Uragan 2, and in this one what we're going to be doing is making a shroud or moderator for the rifle. The parts we're going to be making aren't that complicated, although they do have a fair few operations to them. So to make the video a little easier to follow, what I've done is I've made 3D drawings of all the parts and components, and I'll be pointing out which exact part we're making and what we're doing to it. That will hopefully make the video a little easier to follow. So the first thing we're going to be doing is making the two end caps of the shroud. So there's going to be a centre core which the pellet travels through, and then two end caps which screw on from either side, and that will capture the carbon fibre that we're going to be using for the outer shroud. The carbon fibre that we're going to be using is 40mm in diameter with a 38mm ID. So it's a little larger diameter than the standard shroud, which is 38mm, and we're also going to be making it just a tad longer. The shroud we're going to be making is roughly 26cm in length, whereas the original is around 18.5. So the one we're making is going to be a little longer, and that will hopefully help with the balance of the rifle, make it look a little less back heavy. So we've got some stock chucked up in a 3-jaw, and we're going to be making the two end caps first. And the first thing we're doing, as always, is just facing it and then turning it to rough OD. We'll finish this off later on, as we need to make sure the end caps are concentric to the centre core. We're going to be starting with the back side first, and this end needs to be threaded M12x1 to allow us to screw it on to the core. So we're drilling it out first, then finalising the size using a small boring bar to 11mm. Once that's done, we can tap it M12x1. Next we can part that off. That's all the operations finished for this side, and we'll start on the back cap. And this side needs to be drilled and bored out to 17mm in order to accept a M18x1 thread. So we bored it out there. Now we're just using an M18x1 tap, getting the tap started in the lathe, then finishing off by hand. With that done, we can part it off and then flip the part around in the lathe and finish off the back side of the threads, just so that doesn't cause us any problems at a later date. This part will again need finishing, just like the front cap, concentric to the core of the moderator. Next up, we're going to make a start on the core. So I've already cut a piece of stock, the right length, and we've just got that chucked up in the lathe. Now this end's got to be turned down to accept the M18x1 thread, so we're just removing the bulk of the material, and then we're prepping the end for the M18x1 thread. And that just includes turning the OD to 18mm, then creating a nice gutter for the threads to run into. And that gutter's just a little deeper than the thread depth. But once we've got it all prepped, we can cut the thread using a single point cutter, and then use the end cap as a gauge for the thread. Once the end cap screws on freely, we can screw it on and then finish off the back face. With that all done, we can start prepping the internal features to accept the thread that's present on the barrel. So the thread that's present on the barrel is an M14x1.25 thread, and it uses the face of the barrel for some alignment. So we need a shoulder for the barrel to butt up against. First thing we'll do is drill it out 10mm, and then using a boring bar we're going to bore out to 12.75mm, which is going to be tapping size for M14x1.25. We're going to be boring that 31mm deep, and at the very end we're just going to be adding some clearance for the unthreaded part of the barrel. Now obviously you can't see exactly what I'm doing with the boring bar, and to be honest neither could I, but hopefully from the diagrams popping up on screen you can see exactly what we're doing and what the ideal finished part will look like. Once all the prep work's been done, we can thread the internal part M14x1.25, and we can obviously use the barrel to test fit the threads. The blue tape you see on the barrel there is just a depth measurement, so we need the barrel to screw on till it pretty much covers the very edge of that tape there. And that just tells us we've cut our shoulder depth right, and that the shroud itself isn't going to butt up against the block of the rifle when we go to screw it on. The last thing we can do in this setup is just turn a cone on the back. Now I'm doing this slightly differently, as I didn't want to alter the angle that I've got on my compound slide. So I'm spinning the lathe in reverse and then using a boring bar on the back side of the work to turn the cone. There's no real reason for doing it like this, other than I don't have to re-indicate in my compound slide. So it's just a little time-saving exercise, but as you can see there it works quite nicely, as long as you don't forget to put the lathe in reverse. The next setup is the core in the lathe, as you can see there, and we've got a mandrel held in the 3-jaw chuck, which I made up off camera, which has the same thread that's present on the barrel, so M14x1.25. We've got it indicated in, and we're holding it by the little mandrel there, as to simulate the shroud being fit on the barrel. First thing we had to do was put a centre hole in the very end, then put our live centre in it and turn the OD. Once we've got the OD turned concentric with the threads, we can start work on the end, and we need to thread this end M12 by 1 so that we can screw our end cap onto it. So we rough down the end and then prep it for the thread to be put on at a later date. Before we change the feed levers though, we're just going to be cutting the O-ring grooves. So to cut the O-ring grooves, we're just going to be using a grooving tool, cutting the O-ring groove roughly to depth, then fitting an O-ring and measuring across the O-ring and calculating how much deeper we need to make the groove. There's a very easy way to test O-ring fits, and because we're using a carbon tube with a 38mm ID, we need to get the measurement across the O-ring to around 38.25, and that will give us a nice bit of squeeze on the O-ring as the carbon shroud goes over. The reason that we're using O-rings is to insulate the carbon fibre so it doesn't rattle against the aluminium. Once we've got the measurement we want, we can test fit the carbon fibre. We want a nice snug fit, but not one that's difficult to get on and take off. There are going to be multiple O-rings around the core, so getting the O-ring super tight isn't necessary. Once that's done, we can change the feed levers on the lathe, put it in thread turning mode, and cut the M12 by 1 thread on the end, ready to test fit the end cap. Once the end cap screws on nice, we can centre drill the end, ready for a centre, and then finish turning the features on the end cap that we can get to from this side. All we really need to do here is face the back face of the end cap and turn the female thread boss concentric with the core. This will allow us to hold it in the 3-jaw for when we cut the 1/2" UNF on the end cap. Next up, we can take the core off the mandrel and hold it by the OD in the 3-jaw chuck and finish off the final pieces of the core. Next up, we've got a bit of drilling to do. The first thing we're going to do is drill out the end 8mm to about 40mm deep, and then using an extra long 5mm drill bit, we can drill out the centre. This was a fairly long-winded process, as we've got to drill about 210mm deep with a 5mm drill bit. Now, to keep the drill bit on centre is quite a challenge, as it's fairly long and very thin, so what I'm doing here is just taking very light pecks, using lots of WD-40 as cutting lubricant and to stop the aluminium from sticking to the drill bit itself, and feeding in the drill bit nice and slowly. The other thing I'm doing every now and again is just feeling the drill bit to see if I can feel it wobbling or if I can feel any undue vibrations. If it's wobbling, it's normally off centre, and once it's gone off centre, there's not a lot you can do to get it back on. Now, the drill bit I've got here is 200mm in length, but only 150 of that is fluted. So I'm going to have to flip the core around and finish drilling from the other side, and I did that off camera. But hopefully from this shot down the bore there, you can see that the hole is still nice and on centre, and it's not wobbling around all over the place. I haven't cleared out the hole fully yet, so you still can see a few chips and a bit of oil in there, but you can see from the video that the hole is nice and on centre. With that done, the shroud core is done for now until we get it to the mill. So we can finish off the front cap by prepping the end for a 1/2" UNF, and we're doing that whilst holding the part by the boss we turned earlier on. So we're turning the end down to 12.7mm, finishing off the face, and then creating a thread undercut. Once that's done, we can single point cut the 1/2" UNF on the end, and then finally checking the thread with a 1/2" UNF go gauge. The idea of the go gauges is for them to screw on nice and smoothly, with as little play possible between the gauge itself and the threads that you cut. Final things we can do are finish the OD of the front cap and then put in the O-ring groove like the ones around the shroud core. And then next we can finish the back cap, so all we need to do to this is finish the OD, then put a nice deep 45 on the end. Next up we can mill the baffle chambers out from the core itself. So the first one we're doing is the one on the very end, and to do that we're pre-drilling through first with a 4mm drill bit, then coming through with an 8mm end mill, plunge milling the rough slot out, and then finishing off the sides. The next ones we're going to be doing very similarly, although we're going to be using a larger drill bit for the pre-drilling. Then we're coming through with an 8mm end mill again, and just plunge milling out the waste material. This is fairly time consuming obviously, as we've got a lot of material to work through. If you can imagine it, we're pretty much milling out a 30mm cube, completely removing that material. We're just showing the milling out of one chamber on camera, but I did have to do that for all the chambers that you see there. Once most of the waste material has been taken out, we can come back with a finishing end mill and finish off the top halves of the chambers. The end mill isn't long enough unfortunately to do it all in one pass, so we're going to be flipping the part over and just doing it in 2 passes. But you can see I've already done the ones on the right hand side, and we're just doing the final one together for the camera. And once one side has been finished, we can flip the part over in the vise and finish milling out the other side. We have got the core screwed onto the mandrel, and then the mandrel's being held in a 4-sided collet block, and that just allows us to index the part nice and accurately, so we don't have to worry about resetting the part up when we flip it. And the last chamber that we're going to be milling is the one on the cone at the back there. So we're just milling both sides, using the 8mm end mill again, and then we'll be coming through with the end mill and just milling a nice little slot there, and that'll be the first baffle in the series of the shroud core. The last thing we're going to do to finish off the shroud is mill a nut on the back cap, and to do that we're holding the back cap in a 6-sided collet block, and as you can see there, it creates a nice little decorative feature on the back, whilst also giving us something to grip onto if the back cap ever gets stuck. Right then, with that all said and done, here are the final components. What we have here is the core, so this is the part that our pellet goes through, and as you can see from the LED splotches there, we have been testing the device over the weekend. I will say that it's performed exactly how it should do. It's provided a nice amount of moderation to the rifle, and we're getting no clipping, so no pellet interference as it goes through the end there. You can see lots of lead build up, so we need to give that a clean, but I just wanted to show you that there was no sort of major lead deposits on any of the baffles that could have been caused by it clipping or anything like that. Next up we'd have the 2 end caps. So this is the back one with our decorative nut on it, so that's there, and this is the one with the 1/2" UNF which goes on the end. So the reason we did the 2 end caps rather than just one is so that I just have to anodise these 2 parts in order to get the shroud nice and black. Once the carbon fibre tube has been slid over the core, you can no longer see any of this bare aluminium, so to make it all black we only need to anodise these 2 parts here, which is nice and handy as I can't actually fit this piece in my anodising tank. Another thing I wanted to mention is the raw weight of this aluminium here was around 1.2 kilos before we started, and that was the total amount of stock that we used for everything, all these aluminium parts here, so 1.2 kilograms. And finished up, all the aluminium components weigh 170 grams. So quite an extreme weight saving there, but as you see, there's not a lot to this now. We've milled out pretty much all of the internal features, and it's nice and light. The thing that did surprise me though is the carbon fibre. So this is a piece of 40mm OD, 38mm ID, and it actually weighs 50 grams. So it's not an insignificant amount of weight when you consider these 3 pieces here weigh 170 grams, and then the carbon fibre tube on top of that is another 50. It is slightly heavier than the standard shroud, although it is obviously longer and a larger diameter, so I'm not too worried about the extra weight. It is a very marginal weight difference anyway. The original shroud weighs just under 200 grams, and R1 weighs just under 220. Right then, so we'll put this together and then we'll see the sound difference. Hopefully the camera will pick it up, although I may have to do some post editing to get the audio matching sort of real world volumes. There we have it there. So we'll start with the original shroud, just do 3 shots. And we'll swap out to the new shroud. Try and keep everything the same. Believe it or not, someone did accuse me of faking the test results in one of my other videos. I think it was the moderator that we made, the aluminium one. Someone said I faked the results even though the moderator was a lot larger and a lot thicker diameter. So you can never please everyone. But there we go. Having the shroud on there and done now does make the rifle a lot quieter. The main noise that we're still getting is the action noise from the back. You still do hear the hammer hitting the valve, and also you do hear the hammer spring rattling around inside at the back there. We are obviously going to be trying to solve that, but that will be coming in a later video. I will just very quickly show you the internals of the original shroud. So you can just understand what they look like. I did show them off in the review video that I did on the Uragan 2. There we have it there. Actually does a fair job of moderating the rifle down. It is fairly long, but obviously it does have to do a fair amount of work. So there it is there. If I'm honest, I've always found these sort of angled baffles to be a bit of a nonsense for sub 12 rifles. I always prefer straight up and down baffles. I just think they work a little better. But for FAC, this is probably quite good as it does redirect the air away from the pellet, so it acts as a stripper. But you can see that there if you were interested in the original one. Last thing I'll do is just give you a close-up of the shroud. There it is there. Does look quite nice, matches the carbon fibre stock that we've got on this rifle quite nicely. We will obviously be anodising the end caps at a later date, but I just didn't get time to do it before the weekend. Right then, with that all said and done, that's going to about do it for this video, so thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.